So we have Dr. Reed Noss Dr. Reed Noss is a distinguished research professor at the University of Central Florida. He's a distinguished author, photographer, lecturer to give us a keynote this morning. So, Reed, and we... And we should have 10 minutes for questions at the end. So if folks have questions once we end, if you guys just want to queue up at the various microphones, just like we did yesterday, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, everyone. Is this working? Good. Okay, so I've been assigned the challenging task of reviewing some current concepts and paradigms in terrestrial ecology and conservation biology and asking how they might apply to coral reef conservation and restoration. And I think you will see there are quite a few parallels. And so I guess I should thank my old friend Les Kaufman, who couldn't be here today, but he's the one who recommended me for this particular slot in the program. So I am a terrestrial ecologist, in the sense that's where I've done most of my research over my career, but I must say that coral reefs are, without question, one of my favorite ecosystems ever since I first snorkeled in one at age 15. I continue to explore coral reefs around the world at every opportunity, including just last month in French Polynesia, which was pretty cool. So having established my coral reef creds, let's go to the program. So restoration is the theme of this conference. I view restoration as one end of a conservation continuum defined by intensity of intervention. So obviously there's a lot of variability here. And not so long ago, we viewed restoration as pushing or nudging or helping an ecosystem get back to some reference condition, usually an historic reference condition. Today, we've learned that that's often impossible. And in fact, it may not be reasonable given rapid climate change and things are coming together in new combinations. So as Terry Hughes and co-authors pointed out here, returning to a past configuration is not necessarily something we should do, but rather what we want to do is maintain these biological functions to help steer these reefs through the Anthropocene, which is a challenging task. Even though we can't return to some historic or natural condition, I think it's very worthwhile to identify the particular threats and trajectories of change that have led to a present condition that is less than desirable. So, for a hypothetical forest landscape, we've gone from a natural landscape that was dominated by old, structurally complex forests to a new landscape that is mostly young, structurally simplified forests. We've gone from large, connected patches to smaller, more isolated patches, and so on. Well, we can't reverse all of those trajectories, but by identifying them, selecting the right indicators, we can start to move along some of them, monitor the results, see where we get. It's better than just shooting in the dark, I think. So similarly for coral reefs, in this example from the Great Barrier Reef, paper by Condi et al. Recently, showed that the primary threats there, the trajectories of impoverishment, as you might call them, are bleaching, related to, of course, high sea surface temperatures, tropical cyclones, which are probably increasing in intensity, runoff from terrestrial catchments, and predation by crown of thorns starfish. Well, some of these we can do something about, again, and some we can't. In the short term, in the near term, there's not much we can do about global warming. We can reduce it, but it's going to take some studies show maybe 1,000 years before the results of our current levels of CO2 start to taper off. We can't do much about increasing cyclone intensity, but these authors showed in their model that by addressing those threats that are amenable to restoration and management, such as catchment, runoff, and crown of thorns starfish, you can build a reef that is more resilient or resistant to these bigger, longer-term threats. Now, one reason, of course, that coral reefs are of interest in conservation biology is that they are biodiversity hotspots globally. Now, terrestrially, hotspots have been defined on the basis of a measure of irreplaceability, meaning plant endemism in particular, and a measure of vulnerability, such as habitat loss. So globally, the criteria are at least 1,500 endemic plant species in a region, meaning found nowhere else but that region, and at least 70% loss of primary vegetation. And so there's 36 global hotspots defined by these criteria, and you're actually sitting right here at the southern tip of the most recently designated hotspot, the North American coastal plain, which was based on some work by my colleagues and I showing that we exceed these criteria. And one cool thing about these terrestrial hotspots, you might note from this map, is that they encompass, or at least lie adjacent to, virtually all of the Earth's major coral reef systems. So there are opportunities here for shared terrestrial marine conservation initiatives, I think. Now, within Florida, Florida happens to be the hottest spot within the coastal plain global hotspot. And this is a map showing the concentrations of narrow endemic plants within Florida. And the animal distributions are virtually identical, but plants, there's more species of plants that we have data on, so we get a clearer picture. But one interesting thing is that these hotspots defined by plants are virtually all either past coastal environments or, somewhat surprisingly, present coastal environments. So, for example, the past central ridge of Florida was, at many times in the past, an archipelago of fairly isolated islands where allopatric speciation took place, resulted in a high number of narrow-range endemics. Surprisingly, though, these present hotspots that are low in elevation, like the Florida Keys, I'll point to in particular, have relatively high endemism. We have over 24 species of plants and animals endemic to the Keys. The Keys first were formed during the last interglacial, about 125,000 years ago. Then later, as sea levels fell to up to 120 meters below present during the last glacial maximum, the Florida Keys became firmly attached to the Florida mainland. In fact, almost the entire Florida platform was above water during the last glaciation. Now, beginning about 20,000 years ago, sea level was rising quickly. In fact, at some times up to 4.5 meters per century, which is faster than anything that almost any model predicts for the next couple of centuries. But by about 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, sea level more or less stabilized, and that's when, for the first time, the Keys became separated from each other and from the mainland. So presumably, only over the last 6,000 years ago have these endemic species arisen within the Keys, which is pretty rapid evolution. Aside from these hotspots of neoendemism, what's surprising is that the southeastern coastal plain, and especially Florida, is also a hotspot of paleoendemics and deep diversity. The highest family-level plant richness is in northern and central Florida, the blue color there, especially the Panhandle in central Florida, as you can see. We also have in Florida, again, quite surprisingly, and this is fairly new knowledge, more species of ancient plants than anywhere else in North America north of Mexico. Again, surprising for someplace that's presumably been underwater for so much of its history. So we might ask, why is Florida so rich in biodiversity? And I think you'll see here that many of these factors also apply in some way to coral reefs around the world. For one thing, relative climatic stability over long periods of time, which has retained paleoendemics and also reduced extinction rates of these newly arisen neoendemics. Sea level fluctuations promoted diversity, as I just mentioned, by promoting allopatric speciation on isolated pieces of land during high sea level stands. Several different regions contributed to species in the coastal plain, especially Florida. For example, down here in South Florida, we have a strong presence of species from the Antilles. And then finally, frequent disturbance by wind, by fire, and some other agents has prevented competitive exclusion, promoting greater plant diversity in particular. So particularly in these times of rapid climate change, this particular generality is especially important to think about. Globally, centers of endemism, whether they're threatened or not, appear almost entirely to be also major climatic refugia. That's how, again, we have retained these ancient endemics and allowed these more newly arisen endemics to not go extinct soon after they arise, which is probably the usual fate. And so the good news is that these regions are expected to remain relatively stable climatically during this present and future period of rapid climate change. The bad news, though, is that we could still have a fairly high absolute rate of extinction in these hotspots if climate change is as rapid as many of the forecasts suggest. Similarly for coral reefs, this paper by Pelissier et al., am I pronouncing that name right? Pelissier or Pelissier? In any case, climatically stable deep water refugia seem to be very important around the world, and they're concentrated in the Indo-Australian archipelago. And these, again, like the terrestrial situation, they preserved old species of fish during the Quaternary glacial cycles, but also allowed for speciation, allopatric speciation, when sea levels dropped and those reefs became isolated. Now, these deep water refugia today then would have been shallow water refugia during those low sea level stands, something to bear in mind. So this brings to mind MacArthur and Wilson's theory of island biogeography, because I actually should have pointed out on that previous map, you can see in the bottom graph, reef species richness correlates with the hotspots in those other two graphs figures, which are the size of the reef complexes and the isolation, low isolation being higher diversity. So this conforms to MacArthur and Wilson's theory of island biogeography, which was based on islands or island-like patches of habitat, and where the equilibrium number of species on any patch is defined by a balance of the colonization rate of species to that patch and the rate of extinction of populations already on that patch. And so large patches close to a species source are predicted to have the largest number of species. Now, this theory held up fairly well, but there's lots of exceptions, like any grand theory. But it did get conservation biologists and ecologists thinking about problems of habitat fragmentation. It spurred the development of this whole discipline of metapopulation biology. So habitat fragmentation was actually documented much further back. In fact, John Curtis, the botanist, documented this pattern for a single township of Wisconsin going from 1831 to 1950. Obviously, with that kind of change, you're going to have major consequences. And so the corollary then, and really the opposite of fragmentation, is connectivity, which has become a huge issue in terrestrial conservation. And basically a connected system of reserves, protected areas, might be a whole greater than the sum of its parts, in that no single reserve could maintain a viable population of some of the most area-demanding species, but a well-connected network might just do so, maintain a viable population or metapopulation. And so connectivity has been featured in many terrestrial conservation designs. It's hard to find a design that doesn't feature some level of connectivity. This is a relatively primitive one I put together for the state of Florida back in the 80s, a simplified artist rendition, but this has been revised into a more detailed network that has guided land acquisition in this state for the last few decades. Similarly, again, for coral reefs, going back to the paper by Pelissier et al., you can see the striking decline in fish species richness with increasing isolation from these coral reef refugia. So connectivity to these refugia seems to be extremely important. Okay, switch gears a little bit here. Disturbance ecology is another big area of terrestrial ecology, and it's made a lot of important contributions to conservation and restoration. And beyond anecdotes by naturalists about the shared high diversity of coral reefs and tropical forests, one of the first explicit comparisons was made by Joe Connell in this famous paper from 1978, where he described his intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So, for example, at very low frequency of disturbance, such as hurricanes, you would expect a few competitively superior species to dominate the site. At very high levels or frequencies of disturbance, you would expect only the most disturbance-tolerant or rapidly colonizing species to occupy the site. So somewhere in the middle you might get the highest species richness. Well, again, like island biogeographic theory, there's been cases where this has held up well, other cases where it hasn't. For example, here in the southeastern coastal plain, one of our most species-rich communities is pine savanna. It reaches its highest plant diversity with the highest frequency of fire possible. As soon as enough fuel builds up to burn, that's when you get the highest species richness. Connell had in mind hurricanes for his comparison, and obviously tropical cyclones are a major disturbance factor for coral reefs globally. They're also a major disturbance to our terrestrial systems here in the southeastern coastal plain. I like how the hurricane tracks here overlap and make Florida entirely black, which is a little bit frightening during hurricane season. And even bigger, and I've alluded to this briefly just a moment ago, fire. Fire is an extremely important disturbance in this area of the world. And we happen to have here in Florida the highest cloud-to-ground frequency of lightning strikes of anywhere in North America. That's the red there, and even a small area of violet that happens to be right over my home in Central Florida, which is very exciting. So these frequent fire communities really were the dominant vegetation, the matrix vegetation, if you will, prior to European settlement. And it turns out that about 85 of those plant species that are endemic to the North American coastal plain are associated with these pine savannas and embedded communities such as depression wetlands. And most of the examples that you find in the literature on dependence on fire or on fire adaptive traits are for plants. But many of our animals are also adapted to very frequent fire. I did some research on this bird for a number of years. This is a sedentary endemic subspecies of grasshopper sparrow. It's highly specialized on a grassland type known as, formerly as dry prairie, but it's not always dry, so we now call it subtropical hyperseasonal grassland. Quite a mouthful, but more accurate. This bird has never been shown to reproduce successfully after 24 months or more without fire. So extremely fire dependent, probably the most fire dependent vertebrate I've heard of. Well, disturbance ecology has also led us to this concept of regime shifts and alternative or alternate stable states, a huge area now in ecology. And so as an example, on the same site, same climate, same general physical conditions, you could get either pine savanna or closed canopy hardwood forest, depending on one factor, generally, fire. Now, this pine savanna was thought by mainstream ecologists up through the 1960s, at least, as being a successional stage to hardwood forest, which was seen as a regional climax state. We now know that these pine savannas are non-successional ecosystems. They're not successional stages, and hardwood forests occur naturally, but only in fire-protected sites. They're not a true climax. And so upland hardwood forest, and by the way, in Florida, we call hardwood forest hammocks for reasons that aren't entirely clear. The etymology is not clear, but they're hammocks. But they occur in places like islands, peninsulas, ravines, sinkholes, grottos, other places that fire doesn't get to. Down here in South Florida, the hardwood forest is called rockland hammock because of the very shallow soil and often exposed limestone, or tropical hardwood hammock. And it's very rich community, up to 120, over actually 120 tree and subspecies collectively. Its alternative stable state is another kind of pine savanna, which you especially find in the Everglades and on some of our larger keys, like especially the lower keys, like Big Pine Key, shown here. And this, again, is maintained by fire. With a natural fire regime, the boundaries between the rockland hammock and the savanna are very abrupt. But with fire exclusion, hardwood species gradually invade that pine rockland, and after about 15 to 25 years, you basically convert that pine rockland into a rockland hammock. So what about multiple or alternative stable states in coral reefs? Well, this has been a fairly controversial area, but this recent paper by van der Leemput et al. Suggests that even though positive feedbacks, individual feedbacks might be fairly mild. If you add enough together, you can get a situation that leads to alternative stable state conditions. They suggest we cannot, at this time, reject or confirm the general hypothesis of alternative stable states for coral reefs because it might be very site-specific and time-specific. They might occur sporadically or on some reefs, but not on other reefs. So again, there's always a limit to these generalizations. Another big theme in terrestrial ecology and conservation has been the importance of apex predators, top-down regulation, and trophic cascades, where the impacts of that predation ramify through the entire food web. What about coral reefs? Well, it does seem that apex predators play an important role here in top-down regulation, but perhaps even more important in the near term on many of our reefs that you're concerned with, of course, is top-down regulation by herbivores. And it's a complex situation because we have potential top-down regulation by grazing herbivores on the algae, but we also have sometimes simultaneously bottom-up control from nutrients encouraging growth of that algae. So it's kind of a competition between the grazers and the algae flourishing on increased nutrient levels in many of our reefs. Parrotfish, as I'm sure you know from the literature, are controversial. Most authors, most studies seem to suggest a beneficial effect of parrotfish in that they graze the algae, and if you remove parrotfish from overfishing, the algae proliferate. But some authors have found that, in fact, the parrotfish nibble off a little bit too much living coral. So that's, I think, unresolved, but I kind of lean toward, just from my reading of the literature, the beneficial effect. Now, herbivore faunas can change over time, and we've had huge changes in the terrestrial herbivore and carnivore fauna of North America. Florida actually has the richest fossil record of Cenozoic vertebrates in all of North America. We had hundreds of species of these massive beasts for tens of millions of years, from the Oligocene, like 30 million years ago, up through the Pleistocene, even into the early Holocene, it seems. Well, those all disappeared. The very last of these megafauna disappeared at the close of the Pleistocene and beginning of the Holocene. And the reason seemed to be a mix of climate and human overhunting. But these animals had an enormous impact on their ecosystems. Not only did they interact with fire in a complex way, which I don't have time to discuss, but many of them, like modern African elephants, were active tree destroyers. So they probably led to these very kind of low tree density savannas that are quite different from our higher density modern savannas that we find in Florida. And by the way, the vegetation in Florida, given its climatic stability, has not otherwise changed in major ways for millions of years, which is kind of surprising. Now, might we expect then to find some evolutionary legacies suggesting the impacts of these ancient mega herbivores on our landscapes? Well, I think so. And I've suggested that some of our bird species in Florida, including especially these three, which are of high conservation concern, might be a legacy of these mega herbivore herds. These species actually prefer the semi-natural, heavily grazed grasslands, which are made up in large part of exotic pasture grasses with some native grasses as well. They prefer those to the native, higher statured native grasslands, probably because they forage on the ground and it's easier to forage on short lawns. So these animals suggest to me that they probably followed these herds of mega herbivores across the ancient landscape. And they've managed to survive today because of cattle grazing. I never thought I'd hear myself praising cattle grazing, but here's one example. Well, what do we have today in terms of our mega herbivores? Well, these are our dominant native mega herbivores. The gopher tortoise, gets around 1.5 feet long. Pretty impressive creature, a keystone species. It builds burrows in which nearly 400 species of animals have been found to use, some of them obligates. But it's the last in a long line of tortoises in Florida. We had giant tortoises larger than present-day Galapagos tortoises in Florida, up to through the Pleistocene. Pretty impressive. And then we have, as our mammal mega herbivore, white-tailed deer. And as probably many of you know, here in the Florida Keys, further down, the lower Keys, we have the key deer, which is a island dwarf subspecies of the white-tailed deer. So to conclude here, What might be some lessons from terrestrial ecology for coral reef conservation and restoration? One, I think it's very worthwhile to identify and protect endemism hotspots and climatic refugia at multiple spatial scales. They range from microrefugia, little patches that are in odd microenvironments that are relatively stable, up to entire regional refugia like these global hotspots that I showed you. And by the way, some of these refugia seem to function both during warm periods and cold periods because of their unique microenvironments, making them essentially out of equilibrium with the regional climate. And please help me here if there's analogies to coral reef systems. In fact, on everything I've mentioned here, I'm sure I've missed some of the obvious analogies to coral reef systems. It's important to gain a better understanding, of course, of natural disturbance regimes, positive and negative feedbacks, and critically, the mechanisms that trigger these regime shifts to alternative stable states. It's always important to prevent artificial fragmentation and to maintain or restore natural levels of connectivity. And when I say fragmentation, I'm not talking about natural patchiness or heterogeneity, which we all know is extremely important. I'm talking about anthropogenic fragmentation that disrupts the system beyond what the species there experienced during their evolutionary histories. And finally, maintaining intact food webs that function with natural levels of both bottom-up and top-down regulation. So with that, I thank you for listening, and here's the interface of land and sea down in the lower Keys. And I have some time for questions, I think.
I'm just going to call on people as they come up to the microphone. All right, we do have about 10 minutes for questions. If you'd come to the 2 microphones that are in the aisle there.
Thank you. That was an excellent talk.
Thank you.
Circling back to restoration, can you give us examples of terrestrial restoration projects that use some of these principles?
Yes.
And some of the the outcomes of those projects?
Sure enough. There's a lot of restoration going on in our fire-prone forest ecosystems and savanna ecosystems across North America and other parts of the world. But the hard thing is once you've progressed enough years without fire, again, they shift to this alternate stable state of hardwood forest, which is very, very difficult to get back. It can be done, however, and so some very intensive restoration projects are going in and clearing these secondary hardwood forests, and fortunately, we often still have a seed bank of native grassland savanna species in the soil, which come up even after 100 years or more, in some cases, of fire exclusion, which is pretty impressive. Other times, you've got to actually go in and plant. We've also had in the southeastern coastal plain a lot of pine plantations where they basically plow and disc the site, eliminate all the native vegetation, and plant off-site pines. Here again, there's been examples, for example, the Nature Conservancy has done tremendous work in northern Florida at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve. They've totally cleared those pine plantations and laboriously, at first by hand, but now they've figured out a good machine way, planted the native grasses and forbs in there. So that kind of restoration has been very common. A lot of it then has to be maintained, of course, so regular burning is important, and that's a very politically controversial proposition because people don't like to smoke. Occasionally we burn up houses when we do controlled burning. Doesn't happen very often, but it just happened in Florida a few months ago. We lost a number of homes in North Florida from a wildfire. So it can be done. We have successful restoration projects, but some of them are extremely intensive. But if it haven't gone too far, just reintroducing fire alone can do the trick. You don't have to go in and clear anything.
Very, very nice talk. I just want to see if you have any comments on what I think is the second biggest threat to the Florida and the Caribbean scene now, not just our coral reefs, but a real inundation problem of sargassum coming from the lower part of South America to the tune that we've never seen before. And most of the coral, critical coral places in the Caribbean are seeing half of their shorelines just inundated with a space that's really a second Sargasso Sea.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I have seen that myself. I mean, even we're singing in the Keys and out in the Dry Tortugas. So it's a huge problem. I would expect that it has something to do both with water temperature and nutrients. I mean, I don't know about the causes. You tell me. What do you think's causing it?
Well, it's all coming from the same two places where heavy nutrients are coming from the Amazon and the other river. And in addition, like many algal blooms, a cycling effect with nutrients. We also know that with climate change, high temperatures, it's growing faster. And we also know with ocean acidification, they're getting more CO2 to the exact things you want to do in order to cultivate an algae.
Okay, well, that's about what I expected. And we're seeing, similar problems here in Florida, both with dinoflagellate blooms that are bigger than, at least in recent recorded history, and also cyanobacteria blooms in freshwaters, but then they enter the sea down these dredged rivers. So they're both fed by warm sea surface temperatures and by nutrients. Even though there's not necessarily the causes, they definitely exacerbate it. So, I think we've got to address the ultimate causes. Again, in the short term, there's not much we can do about the rising sea surface temperature. We can do something about the nutrient levels. It won't be easy, but it can be done, and it's a high priority. Thank you.
I really enjoyed your talk. The comparison that you made between terrestrial and coral reef, you briefly alluded to it, but on the stressor side for freshwater, and having worked with Les, and also background in freshwater, I would say that that's one of the missing variables that you haven't highlighted.
That's true. Yes.
Is that terrestrial links to freshwater links to marine. They all interconnect. And we have to think about, not just on the stressor side, but also on the diversity side and the connectivity in that way. So, the connectivity that you highlighted was really terrestrial connectivity, but you have connectivity, obviously, with freshwater, too.
Absolutely. And, not to make an excuse, but I actually had a couple of freshwater slides, but in the interest of time, I took them out. But yes, absolutely true. And in fact, here in Florida, we have a tremendous variety of freshwater endemics, too. Most of them in cave and spring run systems. We have more first magnitude springs here in Florida than anywhere in the world. Huge endemic spring fauna. Thank you.
Good morning, Reed.
Hey,
Chris
Chris.
Berg with
How
the
you
Nature Conservancy. Thanks for the reference to our work up in North Florida. Our organization has gone through an evolution from originally thinking that preservation was enough to, maybe threat abatement will be enough to now, hopefully, active restoration in addition to those things will be enough. And lots of us are working on answering that question. I wonder if you could give us your perspectives on the terrestrial side, that evolution from people, active, conservationists, just focusing on preservation to the much more active and interventive way that we go about things now.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's been a really interesting history. I mean, when I first got involved in conservation, the mentality was still, and I shared it, find these really special places, put a fence around them, let as few people in as possible, and just leave them alone, and they'll be fine. Then we started noticing problems. We started noticing, obviously, the invasion of exotics into many of these. And with more human visitation, we often got more exotics carried on pants legs and boots and so on. And then we started noticing the problem of climate change. And in fact, that the flora and fauna were changing in ways that actually might be related to changing climate. Or across eastern North America, a lot of the forest types that we thought were not fire adapted, turns out they were, because we started losing these more fire adapted species like oaks and hickories being replaced by mesic species of oaks that are not at all adapted to fire. So we started seeing collectively these huge changes in communities and realizing you can't just lock a place up and try to preserve it as the first pioneers saw it. We've got to do active management. Now, I say that with some reluctance because I've also seen, frankly, a lot of cases where managers get a little too enthusiastic with their management. They really love to drive those big machines around sometimes. I'm sure you've seen that too. So there's got to be a balance. There are still some areas that are remarkably pristine. And for those areas, that's why I showed that conservation spectrum, there are still some areas where the preservation model, I think, still holds. And that's appropriate, at least for now. Other areas are going to need very intensive restoration, and then the stuff in the middle, management to maintain the native biodiversity as best we can. But it has been a huge change in philosophy and practice within the conservation movement since the late 60s when I first started getting involved. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you, Reed.
Yes, ma'am. And would you share your name and affiliation? I should have asked for
Yeah, sure. I'm Irene. I'm from the Autonomous University of Mexico, and I studied environmental sciences. I love that you mentioned that there is a feedback between the alternate states. And I wanted to ask, there's this concept about novel ecosystems.
Yeah.
And I would like to know, what do you think about, okay, these alternate states normally are between natural states, but like usual natural states that go through a lot of time. Now that we're introducing like anthropogenic caused states, do you think there will be like this feedback between those anthropogenic disturbance like states that we are like making a synergy to cause this drama, and between the natural state maybe like having this novel ecosystem thing going on?
Excellent question. Novel ecosystems is another big theme that I might have touched on, but I did not. But yes, today many of our alternate states are not another natural state. They are, in fact, a novel ecosystem. Now, of course, I'd like to point out over the broad span of time, any ecosystem within some time frame is a novel ecosystem, because species are constantly coming and going, you know, in a deep history sense. So now it's just happening faster because of human transport of species around the world, because of rapidly changing climate and other factors. And so now we do get novel ecosystems that are alternate stable states. They haven't yet been studied to the depth of some of these natural systems, but it appears that they do have their own feedback, positive feedback mechanisms that are keeping them in something like they are now, and which make restoration difficult. And I'm sure that applies to some of these coral reefs too, where you get states that we've never maybe seen, at least in recent human history, and in many cases never in the history of Earth, but are now persistent novel ecosystems. I think in some cases, again, we can't turn the clock back, and some of these novel ecosystems are much better than no ecosystem, and so we have to learn to live with them and manage them and get the best out of them we can in terms of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So thank you.
Oh, we have time for one more, but it has to be quick, ma'am, if you would.
That was a great talk. Maya Trotz from the University of South Florida. I'm the president of the Association of Environmental Engineering and Science Professors, and on the board of Fragments of Hope. There's a lot of intersection with our built infrastructure, and as engineers, we're driven by one of the 14 grand engineering challenges, managing the nitrogen cycle. How do we formally work with folks like you in all of those special places around the world to look at the land, to see and really manage our nutrients from stormwater, wastewater, and all of those things?
That's a great question. I wish I had a ready answer to it. Obviously, yeah, I don't think conservationists and restorationists in general pay enough attention to nutrient loads. I think some of our novel ecosystems that just were brought up relate, for example, to levels of nitrification that would not occur were it not for intensive industrial activity and burning of fossil fuels and the nitrous oxides that arise from that. So managing nitrogen inputs and inputs of other nutrients obviously critical for terrestrial as well as for marine and freshwater systems. And you know, I think freshwater restorationists have probably paid more attention to nutrient loads than either marine or terrestrial, at least in my, you know, just from attending conferences and reading journals, that's the impression I get. But clearly, in all three realms, we need to pay a lot more attention to nutrients. But yeah, I would encourage interaction with engineers and others who would work on these issues. Thanks very much.
All right, please join me in thanking Dr. Knopf.
Thank you.